In late August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey devastated southeast Texas, unleashing what experts had described to be a 500 to 1,000 year rainfall event. More than 50 inches of rain fell upon the city of Houston in just days as tens of thousands of residents were forced to flee their homes. While such occurrences can be expected during major hurricanes, one critical development unfolding amidst the chaos was far less anticipated. As the storm intensified, a serious crisis emerged at the Addicks and Barker flood control dams. During the hurricane, the two reservoirs approached their combined capacity of approximately 126 billion gallons of water. Engineers warned to their superiors that if the reservoirs were allowed to be overtopped, the result would be a sudden and catastrophic surge of water into downtown Houston. To prevent this outcome, they advised operating the system just as it was designed, simply by allowing the reservoirs to release the flood water into their designated flood channels. The problem? Many of these flood zone areas had been home to entire communities and neighborhoods for the past few decades. To reduce the immediate risk of dam failure, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who were responsible for maintaining the dam, made the emergency decision to begin releasing water. At peak discharge, more than 16,000 cubic feet of water began heading towards communities such as Kashmir Gardens, Meyerland, and other West Houston neighborhoods that lay directly in the water's path. In total, as many as 10,000 homes were inundated upstream, while thousands more were flooded downstream. This decision was also linked to being responsible for at least 2 fatalities in the downstream neighborhoods, where floodwaters rose rapidly with little warning. Families watched their homes were being destroyed before their very eyes. Many residents had no flood insurance, nor even the knowledge that their neighborhood could ever function in effect as flood storage zones for the dams. Homes were left inhabitable, communities were fractured, and thousands of people were left asking the same thing. How was this infrastructure designed to protect the people of Houston been utilized in a way that devastated entire communities of that same city? Why were these communities located in the dam's designated flood zones? Who bore responsibility? And why were so many residents never warned of the risks their communities were placed in? U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed the Addicks and Barker reservoirs between 1942 and 1948 in response to severe flooding that devastated Houston in the 1930s. At the time, the reservoirs were located well outside the city limits and largely undeveloped prairie land, allowing surrounding floodplains to function as open storage areas with minimal risk to nearby populations. As the city expanded over the coming decades, the City of Houston and other local agencies approved extensive residential and commercial development upstream of the reservoirs. Natural floodplains were replaced with paved surfaces, increasing stormwater runoff, while the flood control system, originally designed for rural conditions, remained largely unchanged. Throughout this period, the reservoirs stayed under federal control, while local flood management and drainage responsibilities fell upon the Harris County Flood Control District. However, flood risk communication failed to keep pace with development as responsibility for communicating risk was divided amongst the multiple agencies. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers documented flood risk primarily through technical reports, while FEMA relied on mid-20th century flood maps to identify high-risk areas for disaster response and flood insurance purposes. At the local level, the City of Houston and the Harris County Flood Control District prioritized development approvals over public risk communication. As a result, growing flood risks were not translated into clear warnings to the local residents, with any updated policies or meaningful outreach. By the early 2000s, the Addicks and Barker reservoirs were identified as high-risk dams due to aging design and residential encroachment. A 2014 city drainage study found that 43% of drainage ditches in the surrounding neighborhoods cannot even handle a 2-year storm. When Hurricane Harvey dropped more than 50 inches of rain in August of 2017, these long-standing vulnerabilities would finally be exposed. Hurricane Harvey was not only a failure of infrastructure under extreme conditions, but a failure of ethics and governance. The disaster raised a fundamental moral question. To what extent did the agencies violate their ethical obligations to disclose foreseeable flood risks and protect vulnerable residents prior to Hurricane Harvey? The ASCE Code of Ethics requires engineers to hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. As previously shown, for decades the Corps knew about the extensive residential development that occurred within the designated flood pools. Despite knowing that the dams were no longer capable of safely managing the altered landscape, the Corps did not clearly warn residents nor the local governments about how the reservoir system would function during extreme rainfall events. This failure reflects not just a breakdown during the emergency itself, but a violation of preventative ethics and reasonable care, which would have been the duty to anticipate and warn of foreseeable harm from the dams while also having public accountability. The Corps' decision to release water from Harvey may be defensible under a utilitarian framework, which would prioritize preventing catastrophic dam failure and minimizing total harm. However, the decades-long failure to warn residents violates continuing principles of respect and autonomy, which is by denying the community critical information needed to protect their property, finances, and personal safety. FEMA also compounded this ethical failure by relying on outdated floodplain maps that failed to account for decades of urban expansion and known reservoir risks. These inaccuracies misclassified many high-risk neighborhoods as low risk, directly affecting flood insurance requirements and access to recovery assistance. In doing this, thousands of homeowners experienced delayed, denied, or even underpaid flood insurance claims under the National Flood Insurance Program provided by the organization, while some received as little as $11 in grants despite losing nearly everything from the water release. From this, FEMA undermined principles of fairness, equity, and distributive justice, leaving residents financially unprotected. Local agencies, such as the City of Houston and the Harris County Flood Control District, played a secondary but important role as well. While they approved development and managed drainage infrastructure, they relied heavily on federal flood risk classifications that were never adequately updated. This fragmented system of governance allowed flood risk to be understood institutionally, but never communicated clearly or consistently to the public. Some of the problems within the federal response to Hurricane Harvey extended far deeper than I initially discovered through research alone. To better understand these internal challenges, I conducted an interview with a former FEMA volunteer who requested anonymity and will be referred to by the pseudonym Philip Anderson. Philip served as a full-time FEMA volunteer in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, where he worked directly on flood response, logistics, and flood mapping. His role involved analyzing areas at flood risk during the storm. Through this work, he gained first-hand insight into flood data and mapping to inform rescue and relief operations, including neighborhoods such as Kashmir Gardens and Meyerland, both of which were severely affected by the dam's discharge. Although Philip was not directly involved in the coordination between FEMA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he did provide critical insight into the logistical issues within the FEMA organization during the crisis.
First was their inability to recognize the importance and usefulness of ArcGIS mapping software. When using ArcGIS, you are able to map differences in floodplains, things that happen from flooding, in seconds. I just found it funny that they were still using physicalized old maps, like actual physical maps, which took hours to create using these massive printers. And I remember just sitting there at my desk, and it was just crazy because what took them 3 hours to do, I could produce in a minute. Some of the FEMA employees would look at me with kind of this disdain. Like, what do you think you're doing? You're just a volunteer. This FEMA's inability to accept new ways of doing things, which would only benefit their mission. It felt that they were very stuck and unwilling to learn. The biggest flaw with how it's set up is how rigid it is. It's very chain of command, and it kind of stifles any new ideas or any suggestions from the bottom coming up. They're very set in how they do things, and they don't like to get off of that.
In the years following Hurricane Harvey, all the major organizations involved faced widespread criticism for their roles in the disaster. In the lawsuit Upstream Addicks and Barker Flood Control Reservoirs versus United States, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims ruled that the Army Corps of Engineers was liable for violating the Fifth Amendment for knowingly using private property to store floodwaters without prior warning. As a result, affected homeowners received compensation averaging about $300,000 per property. FEMA also began a major internal restructuring in 2024. These reforms aimed to speed up emergency aid delivery and reduce bureaucratic delays. but this also included cuts to their resilience grant programs. While framed as efficiency improvements, these changes have raised concerns over equity, future preparedness, and FEMA's ability to respond to increasingly severe climate-driven disasters. At the local level, the City of Houston and the Harris County Flood Control District implemented major mitigation efforts, including a voter-approved $2.5 billion flood control bond, expansion of home buyout programs, and updated floodplain regulations. In essence, Hurricane Harvey exposed how long-standing institutional, technical, and ethical failures can turn a natural hazard into a preventable humanitarian crisis. Although the storm produced extreme rainfall, the scale of damage was magnified by outdated flood maps, insufficient risk disclosure, and rigid bureaucratic structures that limited timely action. Genuine resilience requires more than just stronger dams and updated maps. It requires honest communication of risk, proactive mitigation, and ethical decision-making that protects all members of the public, especially to those most vulnerable when the system fails. Until these commitments are embedded within engineering and emergency management practice, extreme weather will continue to turn foreseeable hazards into preventable injustices.
Tell me lies, tell me sweet little